So a warm welcome, everyone. For the people who have joined us for the first time, it's great to have you. You already know the drill, but I'm just going to quickly recap some of the introductory notes, and then we can go ahead and get started. So we are very glad that we've been sponsored by the British Neuroscience Association and FANS, the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies, for the entire series, which is a great new step for us. And just to give you some important quick notes to how this is going to turn out, the entire talk, except the Q&A at the end of the talk, will be recorded, and we might publish it on YouTube. So you may be able to spread that on YouTube as well and watch it again. Please silence your microphone, but feel free to turn on your video for the entire session just to have it sort of more warm and interactive. And we aim to close latest at around 4:30 p.m. UK time, so maximum of about 1.5 hours. And you're obviously free to leave at any time. So yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to Corpus Curiosum, a lecture series dedicated to increase critical thinking, stimulate critical thinking in early career researchers in the field of neuroscience and beyond. This is us. We did a quick intro earlier already, but we are Ines, Faisal, and Alba from different career stages, all working within the field of neuroscience. And our mission is to increase, critical thinking, engage discussions, and connect different early career researchers with one another and with interesting personalities in the field, elevate their voices, and yes, come together in this sense. Just a quick note about you. We have people from all around the world joining us today, actually 37 different countries, from Oman over Japan, Greece, Germany, you name it, which we're very happy about. And you guys are also from over 100 institutions from all around the world. So it's great that we're sort of, reaching this goal of bringing together people from all kinds of different nations and backgrounds. A little bit about today's speaker. So Dr. Bart Penders is an associate professor in biomedicine and society at the Department of Health, Ethics and Society at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He obtained a PhD from Maastricht University before continuing as a postdoctoral fellow at Radboud University, Nijmegen. He further obtained an Edmund J. Safra Fellowship and worked at Bielefeld University in Germany, Canterbury University in New Zealand, and University of Vienna in Austria. His research focuses on the politics of scientific collaboration, credibility, authorship, and...
Okay, then it's now it's time for me, I guess. I will first start with sharing the screen of the slides that I will be using for the lecture. Let's see. Just to verify, is everybody able to now see the slides that I hope you can see? Yes, I see a few nodding faces, so luckily that means that I can move on. Let me first introduce myself a little bit further than Faisal did. I just want to add two things in the sense that prior to all the things that Faisal said about me, I too studied biology, and I am a biologist by training. I hold a master's degree not in neuroscience, but in evolutionary microbiology, which is, of course, a completely different field. But at least it has helped me to critically engage with life science thinking over the many years that I've been trying at least to do that. I teach mostly sociology and philosophy of science, and I do that mostly to people who are not themselves sociologists and philosophers of science. And the same I've been led to understand is that that also comes to you, applies to you. So what I will be doing is speak for approximately half an hour about the question of what makes a scientist. And I will be looking at science from a sociological point of view. while doing that. I'll be using examples and referring to the history of science, to the philosophy of science, even sometimes to the anthropology of science. But the core idea is that, that I see science here as a culture, a group of people that do things together, that have their own ways of working together, talking to one another, that might differ sometimes slightly and sometimes a lot from other cultures that also exist out there, that we tend to take seriously just as much, or perhaps slightly less so, but at least that exist in parallel to science. And I have provided a summary of what I would be doing. This is it. And when I was preparing the lecture, I thought that I was, for half an hour, overly ambitious, sort of to run through a few centuries of sociology, philosophy, and history of science. So I decided to make it slightly more simple. You'll see that some of these elements I will linger on slightly longer, and others have faded into the background a little bit. But if you have any questions about them, do feel free to ask me afterwards. So first, when we talk about what makes a scientist, we cannot ignore that there are a lot of ideas out there about what makes scientists. And they don't all overlap. But if you ask, for instance, and that has been done, children to draw a scientist, just go to an elementary school and ask the children in a classroom to just draw a scientist. And then you can take a look at what is it that they draw. And not only is this something that has actually been done, it's also something that has been done repeatedly. So we can compare the drawings that children made a couple of years ago with the drawings that they make now, or at least very recently. And one of the things that we can mention there in terms of developments that is actually good news is that more and more children draw female scientists. Because it used to be a picture of a man with weird hair standing in a laboratory, surrounded by either explosions or bright colors or something like that. But increasingly, it is a female scientist, but still standing in a laboratory and still surrounded by explosions or other sort of fancy things. While I don't think, and also the people doing this study really worry about the explosion so much, but what they do worry about is the fact that they tend to draw single scientists, just one, in isolation, and doing whatever it is that science is, all by herself or himself. But we know, and you know from practice, that science really is not a very solitary thing to do. Even if you were to conduct experiments all by yourself, it doesn't mean that you exist in isolation from other scientists, and that the idea of what it is to be a scientist also sometimes, or at least almost all the time, has to do with how you engage those other scientists as well. So this paper that I displayed here is really interesting. If you want to look it up and read the whole thing, please do. But it refers to a storybook image of a scientist. And it turns out that there are actually multiple sort of dominant imaginaries of scientists out there. Importantly, this idea that there are multiple views of public views of scientists out there has to do with a lecture, or at least it's often drawn from a lecture that Weber gave many years ago in 1916, if I remember correctly. Science as a Vocation is the translated title of that lecture, and you can read the entire text of the lecture online if you want to. But in that period, but also in that lecture, the idea was presented that science can be a job, but it can also be a calling. and vocation or avocation, or in German, the original title of the lecture, Beruf or roof, also sound similar. A play on words is something that social scientists do all the time. Uh, that doesn't say that it can't be both. But importantly, if you think about how you conceptualize this imaginary of science, it attributes different qualities to what it means to be a scientist, depending on which of these imaginaries that you think is dominant or should be dominant. And the historian of science, Simon Scheffer, and I linked a podcast here in which he speaks about imaginaries of science. And also talked to the organizers before. We'll provide you with the links to all these podcasts. And he talks in this podcast about these imaginaries as of scientists, and he distinguishes two. You could say it's a view of scientists as angelic versus scientists as minions laboring somewhere in anonymity. And I quote him, one image is that scientists are absolutely special people, that they are much more moral, much more virtuous, and much, much cleverer, and that they do things nothing like what anybody else does. There is an equally powerful image of science, which is that science is organized common sense, that it's just cookery raised to a fairly sophisticated level. And those are two dominant ideas of science, and you probably recognize both of these ideas of science. And Scheffer says, and I agree with him, that neither are right, in the sense that you cannot isolate one of them and say this is what science is supposed to be. Staying with the history of science, we can think about where these images come from. How did they develop? How did they come into being, and how? What does it mean that we think about science in these ways still? It's in some way or another, at least. And in the 17th century, in England primarily, but later everywhere, we first see the rise of what we now recognize as science. That doesn't mean that there were no scientists before that, or that knowledge didn't exist, or that people weren't striving to know more in an organized way. But something changed in the 17th century in the scientific revolution, namely that a culture emerged in which empirical knowledge is carefully assembled through experimentation. Essentially, the experiment is the innovation of the scientific revolution. And from that moment onward, the scientific community came to accept that through experimentation, we could legitimately build new knowledge. And before that, new knowledge was mostly built by observing creation meticulously with a lot of detail and very valuable, but it's different from intervening in reality in order to learn more about reality. And that culture was initially populated by elite members of 17th century English society. And the norms that governed their interaction and that essentially prescribed civility between nobility and other elites served as the first version of a rule book for science. At least, well, it's a vague rule book, but at least it's some form of a rule book, a set of guidelines on how to behave. Who we would consider worthy of trust, and how to maintain that worthiness. And it's actually important to point out that at this instance in time, membership of that elite club called science was sufficiently low for most of their members to actually know one another, or at least know of one another. And that created very real connections between the identity of individuals and the credibility of their claims, of the credibility of what they claim. Gentlemen, and these were all gentlemen. They were all white and male and English and older, and in some way very homogeneous community. Um, they do not lie as a form of moral character, perhaps, but more importantly, as at least sociologically, more importantly, they had very little reason to lie, because they could not really gain anything through lying. And they already had influence, they had recognition, they had fame, they had money, they were filthy rich according to our current standards, and they had status, and they had everything that you could try to gain more of through lying already. And that last bit is perhaps a bit idiosyncratic to the 17th century. I assume it doesn't apply to anybody in the audience right now. There might be nobility listening. I'm not sure. You know who registered. But we do recognize that these sort of forms of social interaction between people found their ways into current ideas about science, about scientists, for instance, as independent from everything and everyone. And it's quite easy to be independent from everything and everyone if you have that kind of life. And it's slightly more difficult to be independent from everything and everyone if you have our lives. At least I assume so. Later, kind of quickly fast forwarding 250 years, in the Second World War, 1942 to be exact, the American sociologist Robert Merton was somebody who came up with a more concrete rule book for science, slightly less vague, but drawing from that history, from that practice of the 17th century science, and essentially modeling that rule book on this idea of the gentleman scientist that existed back then. And he called his, what we now say, master norms for science, he called them imperatives taken to comprise the ethos of modern science. And they were communism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. Another scholar, Zeman, added originality about half a century later to that. And if you now look up Mertonian norms, sometimes you find 4 and sometimes you find 5. If you ever want to know why that is because they were edited half a century later after they were coined. During the Second World War, the term communism was still okay, and they were allies. But a bit later, not so much. So if you go and look up these norms, you'll find that at some point, magically, the word communism disappears and is replaced by communalism. Whatever version you go for, it doesn't really matter so much in the sense that communism or communalism points to the claim, the prescription that science should be common property, common practice, and not necessarily owned by an individual or by an elite group or something like that. Universalism prescribes that access to science, whoever wants to do science, should have access to science, provided, of course, he or she plays by the rules. Disinterestedness really doesn't mean that you shouldn't be interested in science. It means that you should be interested in nothing else but science. And organized skepticism is essentially the social practice that states that you shouldn't accept any claim that comes before you, but first scrutinize it, ask questions, show me the data, convince me. And if we think about science, the scientific practice that we know that in practice, none of these are actually upheld. We recognize them as ideals, and we tend to talk about them and refer to them often, but we don't really see them that much in practice. in the sense that a patent is a something that breaks the first Mertonian norm. The fact that it is a lot easier to get into science if you can attend Harvard breaks the second one. The fact that researchers are paid wages and would probably stop their research if they're not paid any wages anymore breaks the disinterestedness one. And organized skepticism is actually quite difficult to uphold if you have to skeptically engage with every claim and not are able or capable or willing to take some claims at face value, then you cannot actually move on. Then you would have to repeat every experiment in order to be able to claim that you trust it. Doesn't mean that these Mertonian norms are not valuable as an ideal, as something worth striving for, and they can help us identify possibly things that are wrong or not so ideal in science. But we shouldn't see them as a rule book in the sense that all scientists are playing the game by these rules, because they are not. And the familiarity that 17th century scientists could rely on to judge the character of their peers, and essentially, as a consequence of that, judge the quality of their claims, isn't really practical when there are 1 million scientists on the planet, or even more, depending on who you include in the count. But judgment of pedigree, they still matter in science. They did in the 17th century, and they did when Merton was alive, and they still do now. But the pedigree consists mostly of the institutions we're engaged with, where we work, where we have studied, where we got our bachelors, where we've got our masters, etc. And essentially where we draw authority from. But yeah, we know that the Mertonian norms, the ideals of good science, aren't really describing the practices that we see. And that is not something that I sort of found out at some point in my life. No, that is something that scientists have essentially always known. And in the 70s, well, at least in sociological terms, relatively recent after Merton came up with his norms, Mitrov, another sociologist, coined the term of counter norms. And what he did was he studied the Apollo program, the program that you all know because it got people onto the moon. And there were a few scientists involved, actually hundreds, and at some point thousands of scientists were employed in order to get people on the moon. And he studied what were the norms that governed the behavior of these particular scientists. At the back of his mind, sort of thinking that these Mertonian ideals had to be there somewhere. And he found so-called counter norms. And this is a page out of a publication by Mitrov in mid-70s. You can see from the font that it's slightly older. Don't try to read all of that. Well, if you want to, you can. But I took out one in particular, universalism, and the acceptance or rejection of claims is not to depend on personal or social attributes of protagonists. Essentially, science is open to everyone, depending on your willingness to follow the rules. And he objected that or contrasted that with the counter norm, particularism. The acceptance or rejection of claims is to a large extent a function of who makes the claim. Similar to what we see in the 17th century. Organized skepticism, the obligation of scientists to publicly criticize the work of others as well as the work of themselves. They should also not take their own data and their own claims at face value, is contrasted with organized dogmatism. Each scientist should make certain that other work by others is critiqued to the best of their ability, but immediately believe their own work and defend it regardless of criticism. This also is something that we recognize. And Mitrov didn't speak about these counter norms as ways to do things wrong, but as part of the social dynamic that keeps science going. Because if you are unwilling to defend your own work, then it's too easy for somebody else to shoot it down. If you are unwilling to rely on the testimony of others, then it is impossible to build upon their work. So both the norms and counter norms to Mitrov were essentially two parts of the say, or two sides of the coin, but you needed the whole coin in order to advance science. And that brings us to essentially the present, in which similarly we exhibit sort of ideals to be a certain scientist, to live up to whether it's a storybook or one of the imaginaries that Scheffer referred to, or the ideal that Merton tried to propagate. And simultaneously, we are subject to pressures. The pressure to produce, the pressure to do efficient science, to waste as little resources as possible, the pressure to build a career in a very limited amount of time, the pressure to be relevant, the pressure to be morally responsible. Various types of pressures converge on us that make it more difficult to actually adhere to this ideal imaginary of science, of which there are multiple around. And essentially, making science according to the rules is quite difficult. So if these norms are around, if these counter norms are simultaneously around, and we say that we prefer one, but reward the others, what does it mean that we have rules? Or what do the rules themselves still mean? And more practical even, how do we sort of engage in the practice of policing rules? So the vague rules of the 17th century that were mostly based on how people interacted with one another on that elite level anyway, have given way to more concrete systems of norms prescribing certain behavior, at least ideals of behavior. And they've been written down even more concretely into codes of conduct nowadays. And research integrity is different from research ethics, not usually written into hard law. Some bits simply can't be, because it's perfectly legal to lie. So you can't really forbid scientists to lie. And for some parts, we also rather hope that it's not necessary. If we sort of exhibit sufficient gentlemanly qualities, as the 17th century scientists did, then it shouldn't have to be done. But nonetheless, there is policing going on. And policing is built on a system that we have that consists of these guidelines, consists of codes of conduct, consists of different versions of these per institute, per university, per country, per supranational entity like the European Union, but also per discipline and subfield. And they all look a little bit alike, but at any given time, we're subject to many of them, and they're not exactly the same. So for instance, I work at Maastricht University, and our faculty has a code of conduct. The faculty is part of the University Medical Hospital, which has its own code of conduct. Then the university had a code of conduct, and the Dutch Federation of University has a code of conduct. And then there is the European Code of Conduct. And then there are codes of conduct that aspire to be global, and they are not all the same. For instance, I've displayed here the cover of the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, the revised edition, the most recent one we have. And in it, 4 key values are mentioned as essentially the result of the choice of what we choose to police, what we can police, what we should police, what we want to police. And they are reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability. And that sounds perfectly fine. Nobody is going to object to the fact that scientists should be reliable and honest and have respect for themselves and their surroundings and can be held accountable. But the fact that these 4 values are sort of lifted out and used as key labels of how we are supposed to behave is a political choice. It's a choice of what we choose to police and choose to prescribe as specific behavior. For instance, the Dutch Code of Conduct prescribes also honesty as a key value, but that's the only one that actually overlaps with the European one. The other ones are scrupulousness, transparency, independence, and responsibility. They again sound perfectly fine, but they are the result of different choices in terms of what we value. The Dutch Code of Conduct is more recent and has taken developments in terms of, for instance, open science on board. Hence, sort of shifting transparency as a key value forward, but again, to the detriment then of others. These things develop. The rules that govern science, as well as the structures that we have to enforce those rules, they are alive. They change. They change as science itself changes, but they also change subject to certain pressures, scandals that might emerge, ideas, new ideas about the relationship between science and society, and also, for instance, let's say a pandemic that helps us realize the relevance and the value of science in certain circumstances. So all of that sounds fine, but there are limits. And to understand some of these limits, we have to think about how research is actually done instead of how researchers say that they do research. For instance, if you take a look at the left picture, it says front stage and backstage as the only text. And it's a picture, well, it's not actually drawn by Irving Goffman, but it's inspired by the sociology of Irving Goffman, who said that public life is essentially a form of drama. And science is also a form of public life, so it's not exempt from our conceptualization of it as drama. If you want to enable science, sort of the front stage idea of science, that bit of science that everybody gets to see, the publications, the reports, the advice that scientists give, the data sets that they produce, but also the gizmos and technologies and innovations that flow from science. All of that is enabled by the work that takes place backstage. People disagreeing with one another, shouting at one another, doing experiments that fail on a daily basis, and people who get frustrated and then decide to go and do something else with their lives. All of that happens backstage, and that is very messy. And for those of you who are researchers, the science or the research that you were presented when you were a bachelor student is completely different from the science that you see when you actually try to do it yourself while working in a laboratory or in a department or in a research group or wherever that you are. But between backstage and front stage is not an iron wall or a fortress wall or something like that. There is a curtain. And curtains tend to be more flexible than walls. For instance, my university now asks PhD students when they start their dissertation to sign a form that claims that they will follow the Dutch Code of Conduct for research integrity. At the end of their work, when they receive their PhD degrees, they now recite as part of their public defense an oath in which they solemnly promise to do the same thing. So where do we place those acts? Are these acts that are front stage only, essentially a promise to do something, but that cannot really be seen as a form of actual labor. It's a question, and I think that it's mostly a front stage endeavor. But that doesn't mean that backstage things are invisible. For instance, open science tries to position the curtain in a different place. Not take away the curtain completely, because that's impossible, but at least put it somewhere else in order to make more front stage and less backstage. Scandals have a tendency to find their way onto front stage anyway, for various reasons, although there can be big delays there. And institutions have policies on what goes where, what is allowed to be front stage, and what is better kept backstage for various reasons. And we, as audiences of science, we're scientists and researchers ourselves, but we are also the audience of science. We have to think about these two faces of science all the time. Thinking about science this way helps us understand why we have to be critical about, for instance, incentives and rewards in science, even if everything or everyone apparently acts responsibly. And when it comes to research integrity rules, there is a lot of room for interpretation. There are a few things that are clearly wrong. The big sort of cardinal sins of science, plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. But even for those, it's actually quite difficult to practically decide when plagiarism has occurred. Sometimes it's quite obvious, but there are often cases in which it's more difficult to decide whether something is plagiarism, whether we count it as plagiarism, and what we then should do. And plagiarism is one of my favorite examples, because for most people tend to see plagiarism as an issue of text. But plagiarism is about ideas and not about words. And words are ways to convey ideas. So when you steal words, it's quite possible that you steal the idea along. But you can steal an idea without stealing the words. You can use different words, but still claim an idea as your own. And in that case, you are in fact plagiarizing. But judging that act is very difficult, at least more difficult than having an algorithm checked word similarities between published papers or student essays and papers or something like that. But it gets even more difficult when it comes to questionable research practices. And here is a long list that is too small for any of you to read, but it contains a list of questionable research practices that were essentially volunteered by people who attended the World Conference on Research Integrity. They're just asked the question, can you come up with a few questionable research practices? And they came up with these one. The list is endless. But the reason that they are called questionable research practices is that there is quite a bit of disagreement on whether they are questionable. And even if there is agreement on that they are questionable, there is then disagreement on how questionable that they actually are. And this list includes things like not publishing a valid negative study, ignoring safety risks, assigning too many PhD students to a single project, and so forth. All of this limit the construction of knowledge or the development of healthy, sustainable careers. And some are high risk, others are more low risk, but there is a difference between the ones that are relatively low risk but are likely to have a high frequency, and the ones that are high risk but have a lower frequency. The fabrication of data, for instance, which is one of the worst things to do in science, come up with your own results as opposed to actually try to experiment your way to them, is actually rather low on this list because even though the risk is high, the frequency is quite low. So this is the link if you want to check it out. So all of this is a dynamic that happens between scientists, but ultimately trust between scientists also translates into the trust that the public has in our institutions. This is a table I like to use. It's data drawn from the Eurobarometer. The Eurobarometer is a huge survey that is conducted regularly and invites various European citizens to reflect on issues of topical relevance at the time. And in 2005 and 2010, European citizens were asked which professional group they trusted. And they were invited to reflect on multiple professional groups, scientists among them. And across nearly all European countries, scientists were, in 2005 and 2010, and actually still today, the most trusted professional group. Despite all the talk of public dismissal of science, all the conspiracy theories, all the things that we hear about vaccine refusals and dismissal of COVID evidence and everything that we see in the press nowadays, scientists are still the most trusted professional group in European society. Doesn't mean that that trust is exactly the same everywhere at the same level. It also doesn't mean that that trust is completely stable. There are things that can happen in societies that severely impact the amount of trust that a society has in the institution of science. And I would like to draw particular attention to Germany in this list. Interesting for all of those of you who are German. Can you see my cursor on the screen, the arrow? Germany is right here. And in 2005, 86% of Germans answered the question positively, that they trusted scientists. And that is, if you take a look at that list, the highest percentage of all countries. Then, 5 years later, Germany has dropped to 57%, which is the lowest number in this list, if I look at it correctly. And also, if you take a look at the sort of the difference column, it indicates -29, which doesn't even come close to any of the other ones. There is always some fluctuation in these trust numbers of scientists. It goes up and down all the time, as long as this data has been collected. But this sort of fluctuation is not really something that happens all the time. And I'm not really sure how interactive that we can go in this lecture, but who of you is German and has any idea of what might have happened in this particular period of time and is willing to share that information with us, a hypothesis at least? No one? Okay. I know what happened, of course, so I can tell you. And for those of you who follow German politics a little, or just were alive at the time and watched the German news, you may remember the name Karl Theodor zu Gutenberg, and he was a defense minister in the first Angela Merkel cabinet. And he wasn't actually a defense minister for long, because his PhD thesis was found to contain plagiarized elements. significant amounts of plagiarized elements. And his position as a politician, which was at least partially derived from his academic credentials, was no longer tenable, and he had to resign as a minister. But also he had to relinquish his degree, and even though 2005 is a long time ago, Google existed at the time, and people were, of course, quite interested in if one of these famous politicians had a thesis with plagiarized chapters in it. Let's Google a few sentences out of the PhD theses of these other German politicians that have at least a similar degree. Angela Merkel, for instance, has a PhD. Her thesis, completely clean, no problem. But there were others, other politicians who essentially got in a similar shit show as to Gutenberg, and also had to resign. And all of this happened in the period between 2005 and 2010, featured the headlines of the national presses, and has translated in this, well, rather large loss of trust in science. And it has bounced back. Not yet completely, but I expect it to bounce back completely over time. But it's lost a lot easier than it is gained. And public trust and credibility of science is something that the scientific culture depends on because it draws its resources from it. But also, when credibility of science is lost, then the voice of science has more difficulty to raise itself over other voices in society that also try to influence policy and that try to influence the ways our societies are organized and shaped. So, take home messages. I'm at the end, so don't worry. Science continues to be this culture of trusting persons who know what they know because they can trust others. That's not so very different from the general public who also knows what they know because they know who to trust. But there are limits to that trust, and there should be limits to that trust. Just like the gentleman scientists continuously judged each other's behavior in the 17th century, is person X still enough of a gentleman to be trustworthy? We do similar things, but we cannot replace this culture of trusting persons with default distrust by the assumption that everything is done wrong and that you have to prove it when you do it right. A lot of research integrity measures carefully try to navigate this line, balancing trust and distrust, essentially by allowing and supporting just enough distrust to allow the role of scientists trusting each other to continue, to fulfill its role in the social dynamic of science. So what makes a scientist? Scientists are not better people than non-scientists. I really do hope that you didn't even think that before you attended this lecture, but just to make sure, scientists are not better people than non-scientists. They also don't have, in and of themselves, privileged access to reality, even though they get to speak on its behalf. They don't have a single unique character trait that can't be found elsewhere. But scientists do uphold, through their institutes, through their actions, a series of values, quite old values. But the Institute of Science and the way it's organized isn't actually making it a lot easier for them to do that. Proclaiming integrity doesn't really constitute integrity. A lot of the claims of good and responsible science that we see are front stage only. Especially a lot of claims made by institutions. So what we need is a skeptical public. just like we need skeptical scientists, we also need a public skeptical of science that continuously tries to peek behind the curtains of science. That is an asset that cannot be, well, overstated, the value of that asset. And journalists, for instance, good science journalists help draw back that curtain and help general public, as well as other scientists, of course, peek backstage. I think I'll end on that and invite questions, comments, and disagreements, of course.